Good evening. It's time for our services to begin this evening. We appreciate your coming and being with us. If you'll bow with me, we'll have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Our Father in heaven, we bow in your presence at this time, honoring you as our God and Creator and worthy of all praise. Thanking you for this opportunity we have to assemble here this evening and to study another portion of your word. We pray that you'll be with us and help us as we study, that we will make application to our lives and that we will be better for the study. We pray, Father, that you be with us, those who are unable to be with us this evening, that you would help those who are sick and return them back to their health, be with those who are traveling and watch over them and return them to us safely. Pray that you be with each of us and forgive us of our sins and help us in our weaknesses. Pray that you would continue with us as we offer our worship unto thee in days to come. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Well, as you see on the board, we're going to be starting tonight in Nehemiah. Those of you who have been in my classes that we have in the small classrooms know usually when I start a book, I start it with the who, what, when, where, why questions. And this will be no different since I'm introducing the book. We'll talk about Nehemiah both tonight and the next 3 sessions. So who's Nehemiah? Well, he identifies himself in verse 1, but it doesn't tell us much. Verse 1 of Nehemiah says he's the son of Hakaliah. Well, I don't know who that is, but I know a little bit more about him. What we're going to see tonight is that he is the cupbearer for the king, Artaxerxes. That's an important position because much like the chef or anyone else that prepares something for the king to ingest, Nehemiah probably had to taste test it and make sure that it wasn't poisoned, because that's an easy way to get to a king or any other ruler, is to poison the food. So that's the who he is. We'll come back to some more of his qualities here in a minute. Who, what? Well, the what is the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the wall of Jerusalem in particular. That's what the book is going to be about. Now, there's a couple of other side lessons, but that's basically what the book is about. Ezra focused on the religious restoration of Jerusalem, Nehemiah on the physical rebuilding of Jerusalem. Where? Who, what, when? No, when. When is about 13 years after Ezra ended, if the events in Ezra 9 and 10 took place almost immediately after Ezra got there, which I believe it did. Ezra, and I understand if you're looking at a different commentary, you may come up with a different number. Ezra is around 458 BC. The events in this book are around 454. If you come to me after and say, I think it's 443, I'm not going to argue with you. It doesn't make any difference, although we do know that from what we read in Ezra, he marks his from the 13th year, from the 7th year of Artaxerxes. And in verse 1, it finishes, now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year that he was in Susa, the capital. That's our where, at least that's where the book starts, is in the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Who, what, when, where, why? Well, because, we'll see that in verse 2 and 3. Let's go ahead and read 2 and 3. The why of the book comes up quickly in the book. That Hanani, I don't know how to pronounce that, one of my brothers and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and survived the captivity and about Jerusalem. Now, let's stop right there. The first group of pilgrims, if you want to use that term, back to Jerusalem took place roughly when? That's right, 536, 535, somewhere in that neighborhood, that they arrived back. That's the first group. The second group, we start reading about in Ezra. Ezra, the book's named after him, but he doesn't appear until the second major group goes back. As I said, that's around 458 BC. So he's asking about what's been going on in Jerusalem since roughly 536. If I'm doing the math right, that's 68 years or so. I don't think Nehemiah was alive when that first group went back. I think he was alive and knew what was going on when the second group went back, just based on the timeline. So he asked about what's going on. They said to me, verse 3, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates were burned with fire. Any of you that have studied this before may know about how big the wall around, or how big was Jerusalem walled in? What was the acreage, roughly? Yeah, it doesn't tell us in the Bible, and if my reading today was right, the archaeologists and those that have studied it believe it was around 160 acres. 4 square miles, 40 acres is a square mile, I think. By contrast, I looked today, and the largest park at Disney World is the Animal Kingdom, and it's 950 acres. So 6 times as large, roughly, as what Jerusalem, the city itself, was. And again, depending on the source, I did some looking to try to find out what was the population of Jerusalem around the time that the people were hauled away. In that 160 acres, the thinking of some of the ones that I read today, and I can't cite book, chapter, and verse for this, maybe around 8,000, maybe 10, inside the wall. The population of Judah itself, remember the northern kingdom had already been eradicated by the Assyrians back around 720. Population of Judah was estimated on a couple of the sources that I looked at slightly less than 400,000. The number that went into captivity and were hauled to Jerusalem, or not Jerusalem, to Babylon, again, since there was 2 different captivities, the guess was that there was somewhat over 30,000, 10th roughly of the population. Now again, you go read another commentary and they come up with other numbers, I'm good with that. This was just the ones I was able to find today. Nehemiah, as far as we can tell, had never been there. And yet he was distressed about it. He heard about it and was in distress. You ever heard of a congregation that you've never visited that was having problems and you felt the pain of it? Sure. In this country, congregations get hit by floods, by tornadoes, by fire, or whatnot. and sometimes internal strife that has nothing to do with the weather. And we get concerned. We may know some of the people there even though we had not visited that particular congregation. Nehemiah had a relative, and I do believe when it says this is his brother, it means child of one or both of his parents. I've read some today that said, no, that's just kinsman, but he uses the same phrase later in the book. And I'm convinced it's his blood brother. Comes and tells him what's going on. And he says there's 4 problems. 2 of them, though, have to do with structure. That's the wall is gone and the gates are burned. That's a building project. You know, you get your contractor, bring it in, you take care of it, right? Or you do it yourself. But the other 2, they are in great distress and reproach. So we're going to back up just a little bit. I'm not trying to reteach everything that we've done, but even back to when I was teaching from Jeremiah. You'll remember that before whatever number was hauled to Babylon, that the poorest in the region received what? Okay, we're going to move in there in a few minutes if you don't start talking to me. Those of you in my class in there know to talk to me. What was going on? What did the poorest get? Land, property. They were given vineyards. The ones that had nothing were given something by the Babylonians. And think about it for a second. If you were working as a laborer or a slave, perhaps, and the Babylonians say, you know what, we're going to promote you to landowner. This is yours. Are you going to feel pretty good about the people that just handed you some property? It's a pretty good psychological move. They hauled away the educated and the rich to Babylon, and they left the poor people behind. They also left some soldiers around to maintain order. We know that from when Gedaliah was murdered, and along with him, some of the Chaldean soldiers were murdered, and the people were scared that the Babylonians were going to come back and wipe them all out because there had been a revolt. But those people were living in the land with a bunch of non-Jews. That didn't start when when the first bunch came back from Babylon. That started when the first bunch was taken to Babylon, that they started mingling with each other. So the first group comes back to Jerusalem, back to Judea area. 70 years, right? That's what we're told. 70 years passed. I said it was 8 to 10,000. What town do we know that's about that size? Greenwood. Let's say that a group of people that we've never seen before come marching into Greenwood and come up and say, Todd Hales, that's my house. That's our land. Debbie Castor, we need your place. That's where we used to live 70 years ago. How are you going to feel toward those people? Warm and fuzzy? Probably not. I didn't use Mary and I. We live outside the city limits. So, but there's going to be some friction immediately when that first group comes back. We read in Ezra, what did the first group start to accomplish? What was their first primary goal? What? Spiritual, but build the temple. And those of us that have read Haggai know that that didn't go so well, because they first built their paneled houses, as he calls it, and just left the temple. They laid the foundation, got the foundation laid, and then quit for 18 years, I think it was. So they then start rebuilding the temple after they are goaded to do so. And there it is, the temple. Those around the area wanted to take part in building it. Remember in Ezra? And the Jews said no. Now, if you're asking to help build a community project and you're told no, is that going to foster good, warm, fuzzy feelings? Strike two. Then you get into the back end of Ezra, what Mark talked about last week. You've got some of the people who had been in the area for years had started marrying their sons to the women of the area. You notice Ezra doesn't say anything about the Jewish women marrying Gentile men. It's mostly concerned in Ezra about the men marrying the women. But what happened last week, those of you who are here? Fine, I'll do it myself. What happened last week, those of you who are here, was the fact that the mixed marriages had been taking place was brought to Ezra's attention, and he decided to form some committee and study it and issue a paper. No. He was told by Shechaniah, this is on you. Be courageous and act. We're behind you. And a lot of those marriages were set aside. Now, let's assume that you're the daddy of one of those women who married one of those Jewish men. And one day you look outside and your daughter is back on your doorstep. And you say, what happened? And the daughter says, the Jewish husband put me out because I'm not good enough. Is that going to engender warm, fuzzy feelings? No. Which is exactly why I think when you read in verse 3, when he says there are great distress and reproach, I'm just giving you 3 reasons why there's going to be problems between the Jews who are returning and the people who are in the land to begin with, and their descendants, of course. So, any thoughts, I hate to ask this, any thoughts, questions, or comments on the first 3 verses? For years I have said I do not teach someone else's prayer very well, because this is their words to God, and how can I explain what they meant when they're right here in front of me? There's some similarities in the prayer that Nehemiah utters and the one that Ezra did in Ezra 9. Both of them recognize the collective guilt of the nation. And I remember sitting there last week and telling Mark, I don't recognize collective guilt today. I just don't. You want to try to make me feel guilty about something one of my ancestors has done? You're wasting your time, because I don't buy it. But, like in verse 7, he says, he hadn't even been there. We have acted very corruptly against you, have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. And he goes on to verse 11 and says, O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name, and make your servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. And this man he's talking about is the king. That's about all I've got for chapter 1, because I got 4 chapters to cover. Todd.
It brings about also Daniel's prayer for the people, just acknowledging not his literal participation, but just how we've done.
How we as a nation have done, because the nation as a whole suffered from the idolatry and other abominable practices they did. There were people, Jeremiah, I can name one, and there were more than that, who weren't doing the awful things, and yet they suffered because Judah, and before them, Israel as a whole, was punished by God for what their sins as a whole were. We aren't judged collectively anymore. But they suffered collectively because of how collectively as a group they behaved. Anything else on chapter 1 that you'd like to add? Okay, chapter 2. He comes in before the king, And verse 2 says, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence. Well, I guess not. He's working in the palace. I figure he eats pretty well. If you're working in the palace, I'm assuming you get pretty good meals. And it's a prestigious position. But he comes in gloomy. So much so that the king said to me, verse 2, why is your face sad, though you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. I don't know much about Artaxerxes, but he nailed that one. He could tell from looking at Nehemiah that he had something in his heart that was bothering him. And I don't mean plaque. I mean he had something on his mind. And he said, verse 3, I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire? He took the news that he got from the people who were there, and side note, he believed it. Faithful witnesses came to him, and he accepted their testimony as to what was going on. He had not inspected it himself, but he respected those who were telling him. And he said, and we'd say in 2023, Jerusalem's a mess. And the king said to me, what would you request? And I prayed to the God of heaven. Notice that there's nothing said here about Nehemiah saying, let me get back with you tomorrow. We're going to study Esther later, and there is a couple of times where she asked the king something and then says, well, let me come back later. But he says he prayed. How long does it take to pray? Sometimes not much time, because if this conversation was going as it flows right here, the king says, what would you request? And then he answers. No, I don't know if it was 6 seconds. I don't have any idea. But you get the picture that he quickly says, here's my opportunity. Because had he walked in that day and the king been preoccupied with something and not seen how gloomy he was, he wouldn't have gotten that opportunity. And he probably didn't expect to have that opportunity. But as soon as it presented itself, he prayed and he seized on it. Were these words that we're about to read in verse 5 coming from him or coming from God? Yeah, I don't know either. But he asked for help because he prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, verse 5, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Whoa. Much like we read nothing about Noah being a shipbuilder before Noah builds an ark, we know nothing about Nehemiah's building skills or general contractor skills or anything about building a wall and putting the gates on. I'm going to submit to you that, well, at least my guess is, he didn't have much experience in that area because of what his profession was. He's in the palace. He's working for the king. He's not building walls. But he says, I want to go to a land I've not seen. Leave your presence, king. You depend on me, but I want to go. And the first thing the king said, how long is that going to take? Verse 6. King didn't say, no, I need you. Nehemiah's countenance, his sadness, was such that it touched the king. And he said, I gave him a definite date, verse 6 said. Don't know exactly what it was. It may reveal later, but it's not in this today. You remember when Ezra went back, what he took with him? Ezra did? That's fine. What did Ezra take? The vessels, What else? What? Money. But not much else. Ezra turned down the guard to guard him with the vessels and the money as he went back, because he said God will provide. When the king asked Nehemiah, Nehemiah didn't say, well, I don't really need anything. God will take care of me. No. He used the resource that was available to him, and he said, if it please the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And then a letter to the keeper of the forest, so he'll give me the timbers for the gates of the fortress of the temple, for the wall of the city, and the house for which I'll go. And I don't want much. I just need some timber. King says, fine. Verse 8. Because the good hand of my God was on me. And if you read on, and I'm trying to find it real quick. Verse 9. He came to the governors, gave them the king's letter, and the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. Going to make sure that he gets there safely to carry out this mission so he can come back and serve the king. Nehemiah did not turn down the guard. So now we come to two interesting characters, Sanballat and Tobiah. I don't want to peek too far ahead because someone else is going to be talking about Tobiah next week, but I'll just tell you, Tobiah is tied in through marriage to some of the Jews. Don't know much about Sanballat and his connection, but Tobiah we will see again 2 or 3 times in this book. When they heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. They liked having the upper hand over the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem. And they didn't like the idea that Nehemiah was coming to rescue, and that's not really exactly the word I'm looking for, to make things better. The rest of the chapter, well, at least the next few verses, is the inspection of the wall. I'm not going to spend any time on that. Nehemiah went out by himself and just take a look to see what the task was going to be. He had not told anyone there what he was doing. Get to verse 17. He says to the Jews, the priests, the nobles, you see the bad situation we're in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so we will no longer be a reproach. And I wonder how many of them in that meeting said, I wonder why we didn't think of that. No, they had thought of it. There's a reason why they hadn't done it. We're about to get to it. Verse 18, he said, I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me and about the king's word he'd spoken to me. Then they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. We're going to do it. All these years, we hadn't done it. And Ezra had been there for at least 7 years. We hadn't done it. Nehemiah comes in and says, let's go. Let's get this done. That should tell you something about the persuasive nature of Nehemiah. How he can stir on some people who knew what needed to be done and just wouldn't do it. And it should tell us something about our ability to stir up others to do what needs to be done. Now, verse 19, when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem makes his appearance here, heard it, they mocked us and despised us and said, what is this thing you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? And I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. They said, you're doing some rebel stuff here, aren't you? knowing the history of the region, knowing perhaps that of the last 4 kings that served, oh boy, I thought I knew them off the top of my head. Jehoiakim and Zedekiah both had rebelled against the Babylonian king, and one of them against the Egyptian. They know the history, perhaps, of the region. And I said, "You're rebelling against the king, aren't you?" They may not believe that. But if they send word back to Susa that we got some rebels here, you think that might stir up the king? I can tell you a little bit about kings. I've never been a king. They don't like rebels. They don't have any use for rebels. Okay, I'll ask. Anything on chapter 2? Yes?
Back in verse 2, and when he comes in to see the king,
Yes.
he says he's very much afraid. Is he afraid that he's going to say, no, you can't go, or is he afraid to?
You know as much about it as I do. My speculation, which is a lot of this I'm doing tonight, is trying to paint the picture of how things were going. I think he was afraid to go in before the king and look gloomy because he'd never done it before. And it was to the extent that the king saw it. I mean, so that's what I thought when I read it. I didn't think it was the king was going to say no, because when he walked in there, he didn't know, apparently, that he was going to ask for anything that day. But that again, that's my reading. Chapter 3, I'm going to do chapter 3 real quick. You learn a whole lot about the topography of Jerusalem from chapter 3, if you care. And I don't. But anyone that does can learn a whole lot about where the various gates were, what all was going on. But the verse that caught my attention in chapter 3 was verse 12. All the way through, they're talking about who's working on what section of the wall. Look at verse 12. Next to him, Shallum, the son of Halohesh, the official of half the district of Jerusalem, made repairs. He and his daughters. This wasn't just man work. At least in this instance, we had some women out there helping rebuild. And that's all I got in chapter 3, because I got 8 minutes left. In chapter 4, verse 1, when it came about that Sanballat heard we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. I've never built a wall like this. But I tell you, if I'm dealing with putting mortar and bricks or whatever they were doing, and somebody's over there calling me all sorts of names, I can continue putting on mortars and bricks. Sanballat was trying to first discourage them from it. And let's see what he was saying to them. In the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish it in a day? Can they revive the stones from the dusty rubble, even the burned ones? And now Tobiah, verse 3, was near him and said, even what they are building, if a fox should jump on it, it would break their stone and break their stone wall down. So the first thing they're doing is the ridicule, the discouragement, to try to get them to stop. Didn't work. So, verse 7. Now, when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Ammonites, and heard the repair of the wall of Jerusalem went on, and the breaches began to be closed, they were very angry. All of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause a disturbance in it. And there was one, verse 11. Our enemies said, they will not know or see when we come among them, kill them and put a stop to the work. You ever heard of any terrorism going on in the Middle East? it didn't start in the 20th century. What they're talking about here is sneaking in on them. They're trying to terrorize them, first with words and then with their actions. Verse 8 says they conspired together to come fight against Jerusalem. Verse 11 talks about killing them and stopping the work. But verse 12, when the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, they will come up against you from every place where you may turn. So these guys weren't good at keeping a secret. And as a defense attorney for years, I said, 2 people can keep a secret, 3 can't. That just was my experience in practicing law. If there was a conspiracy that 2 were involved in, both of them you could probably count on not saying a word. But if you got the 3 of them in separate rooms with the detectives talking to them, one of them is going to crack. And in this instance, it was probably braggadocio, that they wanted to let everyone know what they were going to do to the Jews. So what does Nehemiah do? Verse 13, I stationed men in the lowest part of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed people in families with their swords, spears, and bows. They're putting defense in place everywhere. They're not going to have to try to guess where they're coming from because, verse 11, they will not know or see until we come. They're going to be ready everywhere. Verse 14, when I saw their fear, I arose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Well, that's easy to say. Nehemiah hadn't been there very long. A lot of these people working on this wall knew what kind of people Tobiah and Sanballat and the others were. And it's real easy for Nehemiah to say, don't be afraid of them, until he adds the next. Remember the Lord is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. He made it personal to them. They didn't have a choice. This was their family and their home that they were going to be fighting for. And when our enemies heard, verse 15, it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work. And it probably took them twice as long to build this wall as it should have. Verse 16, from that day on, half my servants carried on the work, while half of them held the spears, the shields, the bows, and the breastplates. And the captains were behind the whole house of Judah. And you're going down to verse 21, they carried on the work with half of them holding spears from dawn until the stars appeared. At that time I said to the people, let each man with his servant spend the night within Jerusalem, so they may be a guard for us by day and a laborer by night. Because you see, as I said, all the people who were involved in this didn't live inside what would become the walls of Jerusalem. Somebody had to be out there farming. Somebody had to provide the food for the people inside. But he said, each man with a servant, stay here. So, verse 23, neither I, my brothers, my servants, nor the men of the guards who followed me, none of us removed our clothes. Each one took his weapon even to the water. They didn't have an opportunity to kick back and relax. I just spent a hard day building this wall. I'm going to go home and kick off my sandals and relax for a while. And Nehemiah said, we're not doing that. We're on 24/7 because we don't know when it's coming. We don't know where it's coming. We don't know how it's coming. But we believe there's going to be an attack coming. Which kind of reminds me of Ephesians 6, where we're supposed to put on those the armor, the full armor of God, because the attack from the bad can come any way, anywhere, anytime, and we got to be ready for it. Okay, I've got 119 left. Go, Todd.
Verse 14 kind of reminds me that every now and then, all of us need somebody to remind us of what we already know and encourage us to get busy.
And that's what he's doing. just as Nehemiah, his face gave him away before the king, and I am speculating here, that perhaps the face and some of the body language of those who were working may have given them away. And he saw that it was necessary to stand them up and say, we're in this, all of us are in this together, and we're in it for, your brothers. Notice he didn't say a word about them. He appealed to their brothers. You're going to be fighting for your brothers, your sons and daughters, your wives. He didn't say you're fighting for yourself. Because you're fighting for yourself, it's easy to give up. But when you're fighting for someone who depends on you, you might just fight a little harder. So, yes, he definitely said, remember the Lord. There's no question about that. Okay,